Hey y'all, it's Van Lufa here, coming to you day 4 of the Derek Chauvin trial, April 1st, 2021. But this was no April Fool's Day in court. I will just say today, even though it's tomorrow. Cheers. I got done watching the footage at like 1:45 a.m. last night, and I was in no place to film a video. So here we are, it's Friday morning. We'll go ahead and do this really quick, and then I'll get on to watching today's footage. Okay, day 4, and again, watching and recapping the Derek Chauvin trial so you don't have to. Sorry, no scrub of the day today. Okay. Okay, so yesterday, first thing, Judge Cahill announced that they're ahead of schedule, so they're going to take tomorrow afternoon off, and that was wonderful for me, so then I don't have to listen as much today. Today, the state's witness number 13 was interviewed by Matthew Frank, and he interviewed Courtney Ross. Courtney Ross was George Floyd's girlfriend. She is 45 years old, a mother. She had known Floyd since August of 2017. She talked a little bit about the story of how they met. She cried a little bit. She works in a coffee shop. So how she met him was she went to visit her son's father at a Salvation Army shelter where he was living, and George was working there as a security guard, and that's how they met. When she talked about how they met and all of that, she really broke down and cried a lot. I guess that day when she was at the shelter, she was very beaten down and upset, and he prayed with her that day, and that really impressed her. So then they dated, and they just talked about, things that they did while they were dating. At the time of his death, he worked at the Conca Latin Bistro restaurant and club. He was the head of security there, but it was shut down due to COVID at that time. Exhibit 247 was just a photo of Floyd, probably the one that you see a lot in the news. They talked about that. Floyd had 2 girls that live out of state. And then in my notes here, I wrote, is this the spark of witness testimony? Usually there's a spark of life witness. There can be in a trial. And what a spark of life witness is somebody who comes up on the stand and talks about the deceased as human and just makes them more human to the jury, says good things about them, and just reminding them that, hey, this was a person here. But then I realized later on, no, she was not the spark of life witness. She talked about Floyd's mom's death in 2018 and just how much it affected him. He was apparently a mama's boy. And then they got into the heavier stuff, and that is, they asked if drug use was a part of their relationship. And yes, it was. They both had an opioid addiction. They both suffered from chronic pain. They had spent times getting clean and then relapsing and getting clean. They went through that whole cycle several times in their relationship. But in January and February of 2020, they were no longer speaking because they were kind of on again, off again. She was assuming that he was clean. They reconnected again in March of 2020, and she thought his behavior was changed. So then they were using together again. In May of 2020, he lived with his roommates. They never did live together. They spent time at each other's homes, but they never did live together. The last time she spoke with him was the day before he died. She talked about how fit he was. He lifted weights daily. He loved playing sports. They asked if when they were together, was he ever complaining of shortness of breath? She said, no, you would have never known. He did have old sports injuries of his neck and back and suffer pain from that. But otherwise, nothing that would show her that he was, ill or would see effects from, shortness of breath. He did have in March 2020, the beginning of March, he did have COVID. On cross-examination by Eric Nelson, he referred to the 6/31/20 BCA interview, and also some further meetings that she had had at the FBI several different times. He just asked questions about their drug addiction. Apparently, Floyd had gone into treatment several times throughout the years for this. Okay, so then they got into talking about one of Floyd's contacts or friends named Maurice Hall. He was apparently their drug dealer. Exhibit 1006 was a picture of Maurice Hall. Okay, I'll talk more about how they were split up. So, of note, in March of 2020, he was hospitalized for 5 days. And this was due to an overdose. Apparently, he had overdosed on heroin. Now, Eric Hall really wanted to get this Maurice Hall in there. I'm not quite sure where he's going with that yet, but he wanted to talk about Maurice, and apparently Maurice was the one that gave him the heroin that made him OD, and he was hospitalized for 5 days. She did not like Maurice at all, and I don't think he was always really truthful with her when he was with Maurice. In March, he purchased some pills from Mr. Hall. I think he was thinking that they were opioids like they had been taking, like Percocet, Oxy, and those kinds of things. But she said that they were different this time. They kept her up all night. She didn't know that they were bought from Maurice Hall at the time. She said they felt like a stimulant. She just had a different reaction to those pills in March of 2020 than she normally did when she took Percocets or other opioids. Okay, and those pills were bought from Maurice Hall. Apparently those same types of pills were taken by Mr. Floyd and by Courtney from March until May. Talked about his OD. She told the FBI, he was referring to some of her statements, she told the FBI that the OD was from heroin. She thought that the heroin came from another friend of his, Shawanda Hill. Okay, 1 week. Okay, so she had gotten the similar pills again in May, and she had a similar experience 1 week before his passing. So that stimulant effect where she was up all night, so a week before his death. She told the FBI that those pills made her feel like she was going to die. She did not recall saying that, but the lawyer showed her the transcripts again and refreshed her memory. After the hospitalization in March, she believed he was clean. She thinks he started using again 2 weeks before his death, because at that time again she started noticing changes in his behavior. So it sounds like it was a relationship on and off with them, but also on and off of opioids as well. And she did say that there were times that maybe she was using and he wasn't, and vice versa. And I think that just caused issues in their relationship. The state redirected, and he asked if she was trying to mislead the jury when she said she didn't know who he got the pills from in May, because in her statements to the FBI and to the BCA, she stated that the pills in May were from Mr. Hall, but she said she didn't personally see the sale when she was up on the stand, and she didn't know if they were from him. So he said, "You're not trying to mislead the jury, are you, since you've already said that Mr. Hall gave him the meds?" And she said, "No, she didn't. She wasn't trying to mislead. She didn't personally see the interaction take place." He also wanted to talk to her about the fact that he had taken those stimulant type pills in March and did not die from them, right? She said no. And then he took the same pills in May and didn't die, right? And she said no. So he was just trying to establish the fact that he had taken these pills before. The pills did not kill him. Then they took a mid-morning break, because they always take a break. Okay, this is when it starts getting into some nerdy stuff where I got excited. State's witness number 14 was Seth Brabender, and Aaron Eldridge from the state interviewed him. He was a paramedic of Hennepin EMS who started in June of 2017. They talked about paramedic training. He was an EMT in high school. He started his paramedic courses in 2012 and graduated in May of 2013. He described his education. He described his day-to-day job, what type of medical calls they go to, what his duties are. On May 25th of 2020, he was on duty. Originally, it was called a Code 2 for a mouth injury. A Code 2 means it's not urgent. You can just get there when you get there and no lights or sirens. It's called routine. About a minute and a half later, then it was upgraded to a Code 3. That means lights and sirens and get your booty there. He arrived on the scene. He saw cops lying on Floyd on the ground. He couldn't immediately access him since there were 3 cops on top of him. His partner checked on the patient, and then he went to the back of the ambulance to get the gurney out. He did not see any struggle at all at the scene from Mr. Floyd when he got there. His partner checked a carotid pulse and pupils. He asked his partner if he was in cardiac arrest, and his partner said, "I think so." So they did what's called a load and go, and I explained that in the previous video, where they just load you up and go to a different location when they deem that the scene that they are at is unsafe. And it was the angry crowd that upset them, so that's why they picked him up and went. And they also left because fire wasn't there yet. Fire had been called, and they weren't there yet, so they just didn't have quite the backup and the amount of hands that they needed for the situation. So that was another reason why they decided to leave. And then he just went through the resuscitation process of how to resuscitate somebody in cardiac arrest. Exhibit 47 was a video clip from 8:27 p.m. that evening. It was body cam footage, I believe, from Officer Lane. And it just showed the EMT arriving and putting Floyd on the gurney and loading him up. His partner is Derek Smith. Exhibit 15 was just a short clip from the bystander video, just the same clip that we've seen, but just at a different angle. He did gesture his hand to have Chauvin move. Okay, and then at that point they put him in the gurney and they went to 36th and Park. Exhibit 73 is an aerial map of the area. He just kind of showed the route that they took from the scene to 36th and Park. He parked and then he went to the back of the rig to help with the resuscitation process. So Mr. Brabender was the driver of the ambulance that day. When he got in the back of the ambulance, the cardiac monitor showed asystole, or also flatlining is another name for it. There was no electrical activity at that time. He joined in with the resuscitative efforts. He was placed on a Lucas device, which if you don't know what this is, it's fascinating. Google it. But it's a machine that they strap to the chest that does chest compressions for you. Exhibit 62 was a photo on Floyd on the gurney, and he was hooking him up to the Lucas device. Exhibit 63 was a photo of the Lucas device on his chest. And also it was noticed in that picture was blood near his mouth. At that time, he was placing an airway device to start ventilating or breathing for him. Exhibit 64 showed him placing the airway again. At that time, his partner was trying to get IV access to administer medications. And then he talked a little bit about resuscitative medications. Epinephrine is usually the first line that they give. He was also getting sodium bicarbonate, which is something that helps correct acidosis during this time. Exhibit 65 was a photo of him securing the airway device and while the partner was still working on getting an IV. Now, I will say that these photos came from a police body cam because one of the police officers, Officer Lane, did go with them from the scene in the back of the ambulance just to assist in any way that he could. At that point, the fire department arrived. Floyd was still in asystole. He believes 2 firefighters showed up. He then attempted IV access himself, couldn't get it. The firefighter then came into the rig, took over and started bagging the patient with the Ambu bag. I think you've seen them. They did end up getting IO access. IO stands for intraosseous. It's a big, thick big thick needle that they use a drill and they drill it into the bone. Just of note, IO access is considered a last ditch effort. When you are in an emergent situation like this, cardiac arrest, and you're trying to save somebody, you don't have all day to sit and try and get a vein. It's going to be hard to get a vein anyway, just because, you know, their heart's not beating. And so, in what I have learned is that you try for like a minute or a minute and a half to get an IV, and if you don't, you go straight to the IO because you get in the bone, and then you can get fluids and drugs in them rapidly. So they placed an IO, meds were given that way, and then he was transported to the hospital. Exhibit 67 was a photo at the hospital. At that point, his condition was unchanged. At some point after the asystole, so I think it was right when they got to the hospital, or just maybe shortly after the hospital, they arrived, he went into what's called PEA, which stands for pulseless electrical activity. And they were able to give him, you know, a defibrillation at that time, you know, when they put him on there and clear, you know. They continued to resuscitate, but during all of this time, a pulse never was recovered. On cross-examination by Eric Nelson, he asked about his training, asked if he had ever arrived to a scene where officers were on top of a patient before. He said yes. He's been to other calls where the suspect has struggled with the police. They talked about staging. And what that is, if they get called to a scene and police are already there, they do what's called staging, where they wait there until they get the all clear from the police to go in. They were not staged that evening. He has gone to other OD calls. They stated that, especially if it's an OD call, police normally does also respond, because sometimes if it's an OD by opioids and a patient is given Narcan, they can sometimes get a little violent when when the Narcan is given. They wake up and they're a little crazy, so cops are usually called to those as well, and he has seen that in the past. He had met with law enforcement during this investigation, reviewed his transcripts, met with the prosecution the day before. Then he was just asked about what he saw at the scene. He testified that Mr. Floyd was primarily on his left side. Then he was asked if Hennepin EMS carried ketamine with them, and what that is to usually use to sedate a person when they're intubating them. And he said, yes, they do carry ketamine, but it was not used here. He didn't need sedating, while they put an airway in him. He was just asking about other things that they did in the ambulance. From the time of upgrade, so from the time it was code 2 to code 3, to the time that they were on the scene, it was approximately 6 to 6.5 minutes. Fire was added to the call after the upgrade was given. After they left the scene, they called to have fire moved to 36th and Park. On redirect by the state, he asked, was Mr. Floyd violent or struggling when you got to the scene? No. He appeared to be unresponsive. Is ketamine given to a patient who is alive and struggling? Yes. It was not indicated here, obviously. Then they talked about more OD calls, and apparently they assess for small pupils if it's an OD of an opiate, that is. On cross-examination, Eric Nelson said, had he ever seen a methamphetamine OD? Yes, he had. Does it cause restricted pupils? No, meth dilates the pupils. Then they took a lunch recess. State's witness number 15 was Derek Smith, the partner of the previous paramedic that they had just interviewed. Mr. Smith, I felt, was a little bit more, I'm a man and I have an ego, which I ran into a lot with paramedics. I'll just say that. Not all of them that way, but some of them are they're just egomaniacs. They just are. And especially when they're dealing with women. And I just kind of got that little bit of an attitude from him like that. He's been a paramedic for 4 years. He was an EMT first. He asked about his duties, gave examples of calls he goes to. He was on duty the night of the 25th of May. Talked again about how it was initially code 2 and then upgraded to a code 3. I didn't put a ton of what he said in here because the line of questioning was exactly the same for him as it was for the first paramedic, and the answers were basically all the same about that night. So I did not put a lot of that in. He just talked about what he discussed at the scene. He checked for a pulse, didn't find one. He checked the pupils. The pupils were dilated, but no pulse, obviously. Exhibit 56 was a photo of him checking a pulse. He talked about what he did when they got him into the ambulance. Exhibit 58 was another photo of him checking the pulse. He did at that time notice superficial injuries, but no injuries that would have contributed to his cardiac arrest. And Exhibit 61 was another photo showing Floyd's face and, the injuries to it. And then they just talked a lot about the cardiac monitor, cardiac rhythms, all of those types of things. Again, there was much more, but it was all the same questioning and answers. On cross-examination by Eric Nelson, is it common to feel for a pulse using your thumb? No. They just asked him questions about checking for a pulse. Exhibit 56, again, the photo of him checking for a pulse. He also questioned about the cop in the ambulance. Okay, so this is where Eric, I think I knew where he was going with this one. He said, if you had a cop in the ambulance, so you had an extra set of hands, why didn't you just go straight to the hospital? And he said, because that's not what we do. And he said, is it because the cop isn't an EMT? And he said he didn't know. But basically what he was saying also was that the fire, he needed backup. He needed more hands than that. He was really wanting the fire department to show up to help. So I saw Eric Nelson as trying to lay a little bit of blame on them. Like, why didn't you just take him straight to the hospital? State's witness number 16 this day was Jeremy Norton. He is a Minneapolis Police Department. He works at, he's in Minneapolis, let's see. Okay. He works for the Minneapolis Fire Department. I put the wrong letter there. He works at Station 17, and he has been a captain since 2007. He has been there for 21 years. With the Minneapolis Fire Department, he is an EMT. He is in charge of training his crew and caring for the equipment. He talked about his duties as a captain and that 80% of their work is medical in nature per the statistics for the department. He said people think all we do is fight fires, and that's not true. He talked about the types of medical calls that they received. He was on duty that evening. He heard the call for code 2. He explained that again. He explained how they're notified. After they left, the code 3 was called. They arrived at Cup Foods. Cops were there, but there was no ambulance and no patient. So remember, they came a few minutes later than the ambulance did. They didn't find an ambulance, and they didn't find a patient. So they went into the store. He looked around for a patient in the store. His partner stayed and talked to Genevieve Hansen, who, remember, was the off-duty firefighter at the scene because she was so very distraught. He saw a cop at the back of the store, so he went to talk to him. The cop told him that they were somewhere else. Exhibit 68 was a photo of the fire truck at the scene. Exhibit 69 was a photo of them standing by the fire truck. Exhibit 70 was him approaching the store. Exhibit 72 was them in the store. Exhibit 71 was them exiting the store. Got to prove they were there. Then he got a call as he was leaving to go to 36th and Park. And that's where the ambulance was. Exhibit 74 was a photo of 36th and Park. Then the two firefighters got off the rig, went into the ambulance. He described about what he saw in the ambulance at that time. He then switched places with the cop. He was at the head of the bed dealing with the airway. He sent a few members of his team to go back. Okay, so this was confusing. Now he's talking about when he was still at the scene. He sent members of his team to go back to the scene and check on Genevieve Hansen. He talked about they had a debriefing after this was over. He also reported this incident internally to the fire department. because a man was killed in police custody, and an off-duty firefighter was a witness to the scene, so it had to be reported to Internal Affairs. On cross-examination by Eric Nelson, Exhibit 151 was a transcript of the dispatched call. That was actually the first exhibit we saw on day one. He just went over the times of the different calls. What he was trying to establish here, I believe, was trying to show them that it took too long for them to get there. On redirect, they stated that it was longer that they were at the scene because the original dispatch call was for the police department, not for the fire department. They took a mid-afternoon break. Of course they did. So, the next state's witness, number 17, was David Pluger. He was interviewed by Steve Schleicher for the state. He used to work for the Minneapolis Police Department. He worked there for 27 years, but he had recently retired. He did patrol until 2001, and then he was promoted at that time. He also talked about his typical duties. Then he moved to the department where he dealt mostly with narcotics and prostitution. He was promoted to sergeant. Exhibit 268 was a precinct map of the city of Minneapolis, and he kind of went over that a little bit, talked more about his responsibilities. He talked about how he was in charge of the roll call briefing every afternoon before his shift. He worked 3 p.m. to 1 a.m. There would usually be 10 to 15 officers every day at that briefing. They would go over things for the day. They would go over new policies or do any type of new training that they needed to do for the day. He would also be notified if any force was used on the scene, and then he would head out and interview the officer and the subject about the use of force. So at this point, we started talking a lot about use of force. If there was use of force used at a scene, he had to write a report about it after, speaking to everybody and send it to Internal Affairs. Then he discussed the types of use of force, such as handcuffs, those kinds of things, takedowns. They showed an Exhibit 221, which was the use of force policy for the MPD. They just placed some more exhibits 206 through 234, and they're just all different policies that they had in place on 5/25/20. They just went over some of the policies. They talked about which circumstances needed a police report and which ones don't. So there are some lesser types of use of force that he doesn't need to be notified for. He talked about the force report, how it had to be completed before the end of the shift. Policy states that if there is an injury, they are to call EMS and render medical aid. That's important. Call EMS and render medical aid. Exhibit 225 talked about the use of maximal restraint technique policy. I believe it's called the hobble restraint device. And they were going to do that on Floyd. That's when they have them handcuffed behind their back, and then they have their legs bent. They have them on their stomach. They have their legs bent, and then they basically hog tie their ankles to their waist. So they talked about the hobble restraint device. Well, the purpose for it is it takes control of the subject's hands and feet to prevent them from kicking. Okay, so the hobble device was what prevents kicking. And if they get put in a hobble device, then the supervisor has to be called to the scene. It is placed with the patient prone, and the prone position is on the stomach, and that they are to place them in the side recovery position after the device is secured, because it helps them to breathe better. He asked about positional asphyxia. They are trained on it, and if they're left on their stomach for too long, their breathing can be compromised. They should be transported in the side recovery position. He talked about the duties of a patrol sergeant that night. He had known Chauvin since 2008. They just had a working relationship. They weren't, personal friends outside of work or anything. He knew the other officers who were at the scene. And then at 8:30 p.m., he received a phone call from the dispatcher She was the one that was concerned about what she saw at the scene and called him. Exhibit 12 was they played the phone call from the dispatcher. He thought at the time that it was just a simple takedown and that he probably would not need to go to the scene for that. That's really what he thought at the time. Then he called Chauvin on his cell phone, and Exhibit 75 was a video of Dr. Chauvin, holy cow, Mr. Chauvin receiving the phone call inside his squad car. And at that point, the audio was cut out because apparently the combo between, okay, so this phone call took place after the incident, right? And Chauvin was already back in his police squad. Then the sergeant called him to talk to him, and the convo was private, so the audio was cut off. It was actually Mr. Chauvin's body cam footage that was the phone call. Chauvin did tell him that Mr. Floyd was combative, so they took him down. He suffered a mouth injury, and then EMS was called. He did not, at that time, tell his supervisor that he had his knee on his back or that there was much use of force at this point. If it was just a restraint, let's see. Okay, so had it been a brief knee to the neck, such as just to kind of restrain him quick while you handcuff him, then that's not really much of use of force. That would not be something that he would have to be called for. Sometimes when they get a patient down to the ground, they might put their knee there just for a second, cuff him, and then be done. But then obviously they should get their knee off of their neck. They showed Exhibit 1 again, map of the scene. Exhibit 267 was a photo from his body camera. Okay. So at this point, he was already driving down to the scene, so he had his body camera on. It was a picture of him in his car heading to the scene, and Chauvin had called him back to ask him, how soon he was going to be there. At that point, since there was use of force, the sergeant, then became in charge of the scene. He spoke to all 4 police officers. He received a summary to the event from Officers Lane and King. They did tell him that they had handcuffed him. He then, at that time, learned that EMS had been called. So he had decided he was going to drive to the hospital then to check on the condition of the patient. He told Officers Lane and King to stay at the scene and try and gather up some witnesses. And he told Officer Tao and Officer Chauvin that they needed to also go to the hospital. They just showed some more body cam footage of the sergeant having conversations with Chauvin. Chauvin was telling him a little bit about what was going on, and Chauvin did say that he would try to gather witnesses when he could, but they were all hostile. Then he went to the hospital where he saw them working on Floyd. He got a condition update. The condition was unchanged. He was told that he was doing very poorly. Exhibit 77 was a photo of Chauvin at the hospital. And then at that point, the sergeant got on the call with Lieutenant Matson, and it showed a photo of him on the phone with Internal Affairs. Exhibit 78 was another photo in the room at the hospital. At that point, he asked Chauvin if he had used force. He said yes. He told him at that point at the hospital that he had knelt on his neck. But at that time, he did not tell him for how long he was kneeled on his neck. At that point, the sergeant was approached and was told that Mr. Floyd had passed away. At this point, it was no longer a use of force situation. It was now deemed what is called a critical incident. So it is an update, or an upgrade, I should say. Anytime that there is a death in police custody, that is called a critical incident. Then there is a critical incident response, such as now the scene has to be secured with police tape. Also, all the police officers who were involved in the incident have to be interviewed right then. So Chauvin had to go to the city hall where the police has a room reserved especially for this process. And he went down and started interviewing. They also asked him about how long a person should be restrained. He said long enough to get control, and then the restraint must stop. So he talked about he was originally going to do a force report, and then he makes a preliminary decision based on, the witnesses and everything, and then he decides whether it needs to be turned over to internal affairs. In a normal situation, that is what would happen. When it is a critical incident, that's a whole nother ball of wax, and there's different protocols on that. He gave the jury a break for a little bit. They had to work out a legal issue, so he let them leave. So Nelson gets up and talks with no jury. And basically what this was is he was asking about the force review and the process. So the sergeant ended up not doing a force review because it was now a critical incident. And there are different protocols, like I said. Then he was asked if he reviewed the entire case files, and he did not. All he did was review body cams. So I think what Eric Nelson was trying to get to here was the fact that he had not read this whole case. He had not seen all of the case files. And so I think he was kind of trying to discredit him a little bit as somebody who could speak as, kind of a witness for this situation when all he had seen was the body cam footage. Steve Schleicher then got up and confirmed with him that he did follow the policy. They did exhibit